Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Off the Podium. I have a friend who I have not seen in a couple of years at least, and we took a couple of classes together when I was at the University of Washington. Joe Kinzer is with me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tigran. Great to be here. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think we took at least one or two classes together, if I'm not mistaken, because I was really interested in ethnomusicology. So I took a couple of classes, even though I didn't have to. And I think one of the classes we met. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing now, wherever you are. I think Boston.
Sure. Yeah, I always remember seeing you like hanging around. And that's one of the problems with UW School of Music is there's not enough like cross pollination and interaction between these little like cloisters of theory people, composition people, music history, ethno, but you were good in that sense. You're jumping across the into it. So that was great. I appreciate that. But yeah, I am now at Harvard in the music library doing work as an archivist in the Archive of World Music, which I hate the name, to be honest. I'm advocating to change it. There seems to be a lot of baggage with the term world music, especially as it relates to, the music industry, quote unquote, and the way they've appropriated different kinds of sounds under the world music label. But it's an ethnomusicology archive. It's fairly small compared to the Archive of Traditional Music at Indiana, which is another one, and UCLA has a pretty big one. But yeah, I got kind of thrown into the archive world at the UW after Laurel Circum. I don't know if you remember her at all. She was the archivist there in the ethnomusicology archives, and she retired. So I sort of got thrown into that role, and I hadn't really thought of archives too much. Actually, in ethno, we're sort of trained to almost have a disdain for archives as sort of the product of colonialism or imperialism, this sort of salvage mentality of going into various places and just like consuming and taking and then storing it away like it's your gold in your tower or something. And then also the early origins of the field of ethnomusicology, comparative musicology. They often think of that as early ethnomusicologists wanted to distance themselves from that field and labeled that as sort of armchair, scholarship, armchair ethnomusicology. And instead, as often thinking of sound recordings as lacking context, lacking the holistic understanding of culture. Part of what I'm doing at the AWM for short is trying to take what we have and make it more relevant to the communities that are in the, I'm mostly concerned with the collections that we have that have a local connection. For example, we have a large collection of Somali songs, Somali popular music, and especially from the nationalist period. And I'm working with local members of the Somali diasporic community in Boston to try to make the collection make more sense to them and to sort of ask them what they want to do with the music. Another example is we have a large collection of Arabic 78 RPMs, shellac discs, and a lot of those are actually American labels, Arab American labels, and feature Arab American artists from like the 30s, the 40s. And so I'm trying to, before COVID happened, I was collaborating with this Lebanese restaurant owner, and we were going to feature like an all-day event where it was going to be talks about the Arab American scene, the music scene in the early 20th century, and that immigrant community from mostly Syria and Lebanon. And there's going to be food, and there's going to be talks, and we're going to create a program with Boston College's Arab music ensemble with arrangements based on some of this repertoire we have in our collections that a lot of the diasporic community and the descendants of those Syrian Lebanese immigrants, a lot of them don't even know about these artists that were active in places like Boston and New York. So just kind of bringing it back into the community, bringing the relevance back is kind of that's the outreach component of my job, which is the most exciting part.
Yeah.
The other side is preservation and the boring like metadata, which is data about data, and sort of working on making sure it's organized and searchable and discoverable. And I think of it as a spectrum of what I do is preservation and presentation.
Yeah.
And that it is a spectrum because typically archives are sort of organized based on like culturally neutral terms, like the sound medium, sound disc, like a cassette or whatever it is. Part of what I think we need to do to transform these archives is to sort of arrange them maybe based on culturally relevant terms instead of just being able to search a collection by, oh, here's all the LPs, here's all the sound reels. The Somali songs is a good example of that too, because part of what we learned from community input is that originally we had all these songs by title, right? So there, in that collection, it's all audio cassettes, but we had them all by song title. And we found out that the most relevant aspect of a song is not to think of it as its title, but to think of it in terms of its poetry, which is the first line of the poem. So the song title might not actually be mentioned in the song, or maybe it'll come later, but that first poetic line of each song is the most valuable and intuitively indexed kind of part of the song. So we started with the help of a scholar on Somali culture, a historian, Lidwayne Captains, who's at Wellesley College here. She wrote out all the poetic first lines because she speaks the language and she can write the language. And so then I started putting those in. And so you could search those keywords. And so to make it more, relevant. So yeah, I just really talking about how to build in more of the, what you would call contextual aspects of preservation and presentation of collections. Archives, these kinds of art, it's a relatively obscure archive in the context of Harvard, which is so huge, and it's underutilized as a resource. And so one of the reasons, a lot of times these collections are sort of arranged according to who might use them, and that's usually specialized kind of niche kind of researcher, or it's just a repository for someone to do, an ethnomusicologist to put their recordings, and that's just a place to keep them. But then they're not really being accessed or used. The majority of people who in reality want to work with the collections and to access them are members of the community that might be relevant, like the Somali diasporic community, or students. And that's another thing that's making the archives sort of more relevant these days. In the age of COVID, grad students have to write term papers, and maybe they're in fields that are focused on field work, going out and doing their own research. With travel restrictions and time constraints, if you're still in coursework, you want to write a paper, I think some of the best ways to use the library resources is this kind of archive. You can ask ethnographic questions of archival materials. It doesn't have to just be, you can take a meta view of it, like why was this collected in this time and place, and why was it valued in this time in history, and why is it organized according to these terms instead of those, like kind of like how I mentioned, why is it organized according to culturally neutral terms, as opposed to something that would make more sense to that community and how they understand their music. And so I think gaining that kind of archives literacy, I really try to pitch that to students as a term paper fodder for term papers and things like that. If they can't go out and do their own field work, sometimes because our collections are considered closed, so you have to basically come through me to access them or to learn about them, aside from what's already online and available digitally. I think that some people think of it as sort of this daunting, mysterious task to kind of access these things. They don't really understand like how to go about it. So that's another part of my job, is this outreach and making it more accessible to people. And one thing I'm doing also is creating these sort of digital exhibitions and simple blogs. Just doing that, if people search for the music, we come up more in search results on Google if I write a blog, and there's a lot of good keywords in there. And just doing simple things like that has increased the attention we've gotten from community members, especially. So that's the outreach component.
Wow. One question, and this might be important for those who are listening and who have no idea about how these things work. Why are archives closed? I mean, they'll have access to it, but why are they closed?
Well, a lot of times it's because the donor decided to make it restricted and decided, oh, this is culturally sensitive, or we don't. I think the biggest fear is exploitation of materials. Like if you were to take something from the collection and use it and sort of co-opt it in your own work and make money off it somehow. I think that's the biggest fear, but I'm always trying to push to make it more open and accessible, because once if let's say the original donor passes away and it's restricted, then it's really hard for us to open it up in any way once they're gone, because sometimes for those really restricted collections, the process is if someone wants to access it, we evaluate whether or not their use is scholarly or it's like a fair use kind of case. And then we can ask that donor and get their permission. But if they're gone, then there's less freedom that I have as the archivist to give that permission. Mm-hmm. So I'm always trying to sort of lower to take down the barriers to access, because there's always going to be people who are trying to exploit different things. And with these kinds of collections, they're relatively obscure in the big picture. And I think that I have found that most people that want access are doing research, or they have a connection, whether it's, again, I bring up the Somali songs. One person that was interested, they grew up in Somalia. They remember hearing all these songs, but with all the political strife and turmoil, they're now unable to really hear those songs. And we are one of the few places that has them. So giving those types of people access is really important. But yeah, it's a closed collection too, because it's materials that people can't just easily handle and check out. And if it's not digitized, you can't like take it. So you have to have someone helping you with, unfortunately, we don't have everything digitized. So if someone wants something, I have to arrange for that to be reformatted and then give them access in a limited way. So it surrounds the nature of preservation and the nature of whatever the donor wants. And usually the donor errs on the side of conservatism, I found, as far as access.
I was wondering if the person who donated that book or whatever, the manuscript or whatever it might be, and they're gone, but the book is not written by the person who gave it to you. The book was written, say, 300 years ago.
Right.
Is that the owner's book at that point if the owner is gone? Or is that, I'm sure maybe you've thought about this, but in some ways, I guess it is the person who gave you the book, and it's based on what they believe should happen with the book and their, the access and all of this. But at the same time, they're gone, and that book was not written by them or whatever it might be. It was written 300 years ago. Now, shouldn't it give the opportunity to people, or the people who are in your position, to make the decision to do whatever they want with that?
Right. And you saw the red flag go up when we start talking about or using terms like that relate to ownership. So that was a good red flag that you saw. And I think, so most of the things I'm working with are sound recordings. Who's to say that whoever donated it really owned it? I mean, I guess in a legal sense, because hopefully they gained the proper permissions to record, that they own it. because it's their recording. They undertook the effort to record this or that. But I think that's also part of why these are closed collections, because there's a real sensibility amongst a lot of these people who are doing ethnography and recording that they don't own the culture. They don't own the intangible cultural heritage materials that that they're gathering. So to sort of make the choice to just completely open these collections up to the world would be a choice that an owner would make, and they don't often feel like they're owners. But when it comes to the Arabic 78s that I mentioned, a lot of those, especially the really early ones, the copyright kind of falls away after, I think it's like 100 years.
Okay.
So we no longer need that kind of permission after a certain time, if it's commercial recording. So this is the distinction between commercial recordings and original ethnographic sound recordings. But yeah, that's part of why it's closed, is because there's a lot of gray area and a lot of judgment that needs to be made about what does it mean to own something? What does it mean, who can really make those decisions? Especially if it's an important intangible cultural heritage from a community, that if it's a community that's marginalized in any way or underserved. So this is the stuff you're always grappling with when you're in this kind of position, is how do you become a proper custodian of cultural heritage, especially when you're not part of these groups. We have so many different kinds of collections, and even being an expert on even one of those is difficult. I actually don't, my field work was in Malaysia, so we don't have anything from Malaysia in our collections. So I'm not even an expert in any of this stuff. I was drawn to the AWM though, because they have a focus on what might be called Islamic cultural heritage, or Islamic adjacent, I sometimes call it, where there's aesthetic features that are shared across cultures, like a lot of the Arab Islamic melodies that you can find in a lot of this kind of music is shared. We have recordings by Jewish Pizmonim artists, and they share some of the same melodies, but it's on one side it's Jews and on the other side it's Muslims, but they're sharing something culturally. So those are the interesting kind of things that I'm drawn to, and what we have. We have a lot of music from West Asia, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the way that they sort of relate to one another is always interesting to me.
Well, one thing that I thought about, and I've always thought about this, and I'm so inspired, and actually just I find it really amazing that so many people who are not part of a certain culture might not know the language well, but they're still interested in exploring that part of the world or that country. Based on your experiences, because I know you've done this type of work, what are the biggest barriers? I know language is a barrier, but what else do you think is a barrier based on the type of work you've done? When you go to a different country, you're trying to explore the music, the culture, and you're not part of that culture. You were not born in that part of the world. What are some barriers? What are some experiences that you've gone through in doing this type of work?
Well, yeah, doing ethnography so my work was primarily amongst Malay Muslims. That's how they'd identify themselves. And sometimes my worldviews would be polar opposite to theirs. And I found that, and this is kind of a zeitgeist amongst ethnomusicologists particularly, is that the more outside you are, the more questions you will think of that an insider might not think of. And I found that there were a lot of internal politics in the groups I was working with, and they wouldn't tell each other things that they would tell me. So maybe that was just luck, but a lot of times being an outsider, it would give them a chance to sort of take a more reflective view about what they were doing and think about the politic, maybe the identity politics involved. Whereas before, maybe it's just amongst the community, it's just taken for granted. But then when someone comes in and starts asking all these questions from the outside, it takes a second to sort of actually reflect on those things and articulate it. But some of those things aren't articulatable, right, through language. And so that's one way that you become an insider, a kind of an insider, is by getting in there and learning the music and playing with other people and not talking, right? So that's where music is special, and we can sort of jump in without needing necessarily to know the language and different things. I did study Malay, so the more inside knowledge you can acquire, the better. But I often felt like being an outsider was advantageous. But then it's, of course, it's a disadvantage in other ways, right? People always, so the music I studied was mostly surrounding this instrument called the gambus, and it is, in Malaysia, they call anything that's an Arab kind of lute. That's where it comes from originally, by way of the Indian Ocean trade routes from Yemen, and maybe around the 15th century, bringing this lute to the Malay world, and they adopted it into these genres over time that are considered Malay traditional music.
You were presented recently a paper at the Ethnomusicology Society, from what I understand. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. Say a little bit about that and what you presented and the reception, maybe, and how you presented during these times. I'm sure it was online.
Sure. Yeah. So I talked about basically what I started this our discussion talking about, which was the title of my paper was Building Robust Archives Through Local Collaborations. So I presented through Zoom, and it basically worked out pretty well. I got a lot of positive feedback, and like I said earlier, there's kind of this, it's almost like the politically correct kind of sensibility to have towards archives, where you're thinking of it as more of this is like associated with colonialism and it's armchair research. But then I can see this kind of sea change almost happening with the attitudes about archives, and seeing how they can really be agents in community organizing, agents in, especially with work of what we call repatriation, taking these materials and putting them back into the hands of the descendants of some of these musicians, and work like that, I think, makes the archives very relevant. And to dismiss the archives as colonial, as part of an institution that didn't necessarily have the community from which it derived in mind, I think to dismiss that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of mentality. Because we deal in these cultural riches, really, where we have all of this amazing material, especially, sometimes we have things that we have unique things that other parts of the world you can't find, and we're the only place you can find it. So I think we have a responsibility to think about what we need to do with them, instead of just being good at putting them away and preserving them, but how can we engage people with them? So that's what the talk was about.
Wow.
And I talked about mostly 3 different projects. One was dealing with the Somali songs. Another was the Arabic 78s, which I mentioned. And the last collection is something I've been working closely on with scholar, and he is the current Maharaja of the Drangadra, what was formerly a dynasty in India. And we have a lot of these court music from that dynasty. And he is an anthropologist at Temple. His name is Jayasinji Jala. and he's also a professor at Harvard. And so I've been working closely with him to sort of fill in a lot of the details about the collection that he donated on his family's dynastic history, working on translation projects and things like that. So I talked about those three things: the Somali songs, the Arabic 78s, especially the Arab American part of that, and then the Drangadra court music. All of three of these collections have a local connection.
Yeah.
And so I can add that context to by using local knowledge.
And is this connected to another project? If I'm not mistaken, you did something, recordings by female Muslim court musicians. Is this somehow connected with that?
Yeah, so that's part of the Jayasinji Jala collection of Drangadra music. He goes by the name Bapa, and he's quite a character. He's really amazing person. I'm creating a companion site to this collection, and part of that is these digital exhibitions. And so tracing the little threads and the stories of this collection. And one big story is the Muslim female vocalists that for centuries were part of telling the story, the oral history, and singing the poetry, and singing the genealogical history, and singing about the courtly life and the various ceremonies that occur. And it was tasked, it was a Hindu court, but these Muslim female vocalists were the ones upholding the musical side of this oral history. And so it's an interesting way that, again, like I mentioned with the Jewish Pizmonim, sharing these melodies with Muslims, it's kind of the same. It's this historical, a historical occurrence of cross-cultural harmony and collaboration that over time became more difficult. But early on, like the Muslim conquest of Western India, 13th century, around that time, actually, there was still there was like Muslim sultanates and Hindu courts that actually were fairly collaborative and worked together in many ways, and would exchange ideas and services and things, and work together diplomatically over time. And this was an example of that. So I'm trying to learn more about this. It's not my area, but through his local knowledge, Bapa, he's telling me all about it. And I thought that a good way, it's hard to just, when you have a finding aid for a collection, for example, you can list out all the songs, you can list out all the genres and have some brief information about each one. But to really tell those stories, who's left to tell those stories? I haven't met an ethnomusicologist that is talking about these exact traditions. And I'm not sure if there are any. And Bapa he's not an ethnomusicologist. He has a lot of the knowledge, but his work doesn't really relate to the music, but he has all the musical knowledge. So he wants me to help him tell these stories. So one of the things I'm doing is he has all these palaces. So the palaces in the kingdom, there's all these floor plans, like blueprint, like maps. And so using ArcGIS story maps, it's a platform. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's like a digital curation kind of platform to tell a story. And so linking these various court traditions to the palace floor plans, and to like pointing to the different uses of space, because that's a really important part of these courtly traditions. And one of the palaces was a female only palace. And so looking at the different parts of the palace and where they would sing this type of song versus another, and telling that story through this digital exhibition platform is one project I have going in collaboration with him.
Wow. That's amazing, Joe. This is so great because it's so it's always interesting to talk to someone who's an expert in these fields and knows so much about it, because you could go on talking about this probably for the next 5 hours. So it's really been interesting. But since we don't have much time, I tried to keep this podcast in under an hour. I want to jump to a different, going back like a decade. One thing that kind of surprised me is that when I know ethnomusicologists, and when thinking of an ethnomusicologist, I always associate that with someone who probably got a bachelor's degree in music, or some kind of an instrument performance, music education, maybe music history. I don't know any of those things. But when I looked at your bio, I read that your studies were, I think you majored in philosophy with a minor in religious studies.
Yeah.
Why those things? And the second part of the question, how did that lead you to have, continue in the ethnomusicology path?
Right. So, yeah, I was a philosophy major, but I played music and loved music since I was really young. But, seeing a lot of my friends that majored in music, spending 8 hours a day alone in a practice room. And I have a lot of family members who are also professional musicians, and seeing their life, I very much admire it. But I was always either maybe not disciplined enough, or I just wanted to ask people questions about why they made the music, as well as participate in it. So, for a while I was like in college, I was playing in jazz combos and things like that. I was involved with the School of Music. That was at Illinois State University. I was playing jazz, I was really into jazz guitar, but I wasn't willing to sort of just focus on one thing. I found out about Javanese gamelan, which is this Indonesian ensemble. And then I took a class randomly in ethnomusicology at ISU from a guy named Tom Foe. And he really introduced me to the field. And then that's what led me to Northern Illinois University, because when I graduated with the philosophy degree, I was very poised to sort of continue on with a lot of my cohort went on to law school, or some of them went on to grad school in philosophy. So I was poised to do something like that, but no one knew how, like my advisors didn't really know how to guide me into transitioning to music somehow, or music scholarship. So I contacted Ray Ching Wong at Northern Illinois University, because I was so close. It was like an hour away from where I live. And I knew they had gamelan. And so I just thought, maybe I could go back and get a bachelor's degree in music, because that seemed to be the trajectory, like you mentioned, like you do a bachelor's degree in music, then you go into ethno. But she said, why not just jump right into a master of music? Why, you don't have to do another bachelor's degree, and we'll do all your remedial. They made me take all the theory classes and history of Western music classes. But what I loved about NIU was the performance opportunities. I was able to play in the Chinese silken bamboo ensemble. I played in the Middle Eastern music ensemble there. I played in the gamelan. I even played for a little bit in a jazz combo with the guitar. So it was like all this opportunity to perform, which I loved, and sort of really kind of delve into more of like a performance mode as a scholar and a performer. But also I took anthropology classes there at NIU. And so that was a great sort of foray into just the very like dynamic life that you can have as a scholar and performer. And to jump into learning about culture through performance and playing. So I learned about ethnography as a genre of writing through my anthropology professors. One in particular, her name was Kate Weigel. She's an anthropologist that taught me methods in ethnography. That was a great seminar I took at NIU. And so that kind of primed me to apply to a PhD program in ethnomusicology. So, and it all fits together because this is humanities work. So it's philosophy fits in very well, and it comes up a lot when you're thinking about your theoretical orientations towards thinking about humans making music. It's all relevant, and has now led me to, I teach at Antioch University. I'm doing online grad seminars in as broad of a class as you could ever get, research methods in the humanities. So trying to narrow that down into a grad seminar and helping these students who are in a range of, like one of my students is sort of looking at the history of children's literature. Another student is more of he's an environmental activist. So all these disparate kinds of fields, but they all come together on this under the umbrella of humanities research, and trying to also always trying to insert music into our conversations and turning these students onto how music might be relevant to their own studies, where they might have not otherwise realized that music was a viable option for them to look at. Or just sound studies too. Like with environmental activism, thinking about noise pollution, thinking about use of sound, sound in protest, sound in crisis. You know, there's, so I'm always an advocate for music studies with these students.
Everything you've done, all the studies, all the different places that you've been, all the research that you've done, is there one person, a figure, someone who, based on your studies, that person is no longer around, but you wish they were around because you had a question, you wish you could you sit down with them and have some kind of a conversation about that specific song they recorded, or the composition, something, or it doesn't even have to be with music, someone who's just a figure that you wish you met and it would have kind of benefited your research. Is there someone like that?
Well, the problem is that's actually a question I would ask. That's a good ethnographic question. It's a question I would ask people in my own research. But of course, with me, it seems like the list is pretty long. I don't know if I could narrow it down to just one. I have to think about it.
Yeah. You have a book, or it's coming out. You want to say a little bit about the book and
Sure.
share some of your thoughts, because I think it has not come out yet based on what I've read.
No, it's still a work in progress. As many things, COVID sort of slowed down the progress. So the tentative title, and I'm in talks with Routledge, or Routledge. I never know how to say the publisher. They have invited they've done the review of my proposal and have invited the full manuscript, but I was set to do more research in Malaysia on this for another chapter, and that got canceled last summer. So maybe this coming summer, it's not clear, but the tentative title is Arab Lutes and Global Routes, or Roots in the music of Muslim Malaysia. Just looking at the way that specifically and it's not just Arab, but it's the whole Indian Ocean, the trade networks throughout the Indian Ocean, and the kinds of aesthetic features and musical instruments and song forms and different things that were exchanged, especially between Muslims of the Indian Ocean. You can find similarities in East Africa. You can find similarities in Southeast Asia, the Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, in India, off the west coast of India. There's all this cultural exchange going on. And in Malaysia, in recent politics, they've, post-colonial politics, they've really arranged their political parties based on these sort of homogenized notions of race. So there's like three major races in Malaysia. Indigenous, which includes the majority Malay Muslim category. There's Chinese and there's Indian. And that really makes static a very more, in reality, historically hybrid interaction between these cultures, and it's much more complicated than the politics makes it. So I look at ways that this instrument, that if you just latch onto one instrument, which is the Arab oud, or what they also call the gambus in Malaysia, which comes from a Hadrami Yemeni word, how that sort of enables and constrains and complicates ideas of Malay identity and Malaysian national identity, and the way that the constructions of this identity over time have been so hybrid and mixed, with influences from Hindu-Buddhist empires and Islamic sultanates and European colonizers. I found that latching onto a musical instrument really just acts as a foil against which to sort of interrogate identity politics and what's happening and how it's relevant in contemporary society. Also, the materiality of the instrument itself, the woods from which it was made out of, gets caught up in all of this politics as well. Like the imported ouds, which is the Arab lute from places like Egypt and Turkey, are very popular amongst musicians in Malaysia, but it's seen as sort of this foreign thing. And a lot of people say, oh, no, you're Arabizing our culture too much. So my teacher, one of my teachers, he built a kind of oud that was in the Turco-Arab kind of style, but out of local Malaysian woods. So he took, because he said, those are made for a desert climate. We need something that's that same quality, but made for a rainforest tropical climate. And so just having the capital, the symbolic capital of having local materials, but on this iconic, very like Middle Eastern looking instrument, sort of, it just engaged the cultural politics in really interesting ways. And so that's basically what I'm looking at.
Thank you so much, Joel. It's been a pleasure, and we could go on and talk for forever, but it's been around 50 minutes at this point. So thank you so much for joining me. Anything else? Any last words before we end today?
No, well, thanks for having me on. I'd like to interview you. I want to learn more about you.
Well, no, we should definitely do this because I have more questions, but I think it'll be best for another time to have you on. Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, Tigran.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Off the Podium. If you enjoyed this episode, please comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.